"You look exactly like my son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died alone. Nobody sat with him." The biker turned around slowly. His jaw tightened. His eyes, those hard, weathered eyes that had seen nothing but open roads and closed doors, began to glisten. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. And what came out wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was something he hadn't let out in 37 years. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning that changed everything started the way most mornings in Clover Falls, Georgia did, quietly, without ceremony, without warning. The Bluebell Diner had been sitting on the corner of Route 9 and Maple Street since 1961. It smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease and something deeper, something harder to name, the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary conversations, arguments, first dates, last meals. The booths were cracked vinyl, the countertops were scratched formica, and the little bell above the door had a chipped edge that made it ring with a slightly broken sound. But people kept coming back. Not for the food necessarily, for the feeling that somewhere in the world a place still existed that hadn't changed. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of October morning where the air had gone sharp overnight and nobody was quite ready for it yet. Margaret Elaine Holloway, 96 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, white hair pinned back with 2 bobby pins, the exact same way she had worn it since 1974, walked through the door of the Bluebell Diner at precisely 7:15 a.m., the same time she had walked through that door every Tuesday for the past 11 years. The bell chimed its broken little chime. "Morning, Miss Maggie," called Donna, the waitress, a heavy-set woman in her early 40s, who wore her exhaustion the way some people wear perfume, always present, never quite overwhelming. "Your usual spot's open." "Of course it is," Margaret said without looking up. She moved slowly but not uncertainly. Every step had a destination. She settled into the corner booth by the window, booth 6, the one that looked directly out onto the small concrete lot where 3 cars were parked and a rusted green garbage can stood near the side wall. She picked up the menu she had never once needed to read and held it in front of her face because it was what you did. "Coffee," she said. "Already coming," said Donna. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that if you weren't paying attention, you would miss entirely. Margaret heard it before she saw it. The low, sustained growl of a motorcycle engine cutting through the morning quiet, not racing, not revving, just rolling in slow, the way something tired rolls to a stop. Then the engine cut off. Then silence. She lowered her menu slightly. Through the window, she watched a man climb off a motorcycle and stand beside it for a moment without moving. He was large, not just tall, but the kind of large that came from years of physical labor, from carrying things heavier than other people could carry. He wore a black leather jacket that had seen considerable road time, dark jeans, heavy boots, a gray beard close-cropped, hair to his shoulders mostly silver. He was somewhere in his early 60s, maybe late 50s, if life had been hard to him, and life, Margaret could tell, immediately had been very hard to him. He stood beside his motorcycle and looked at the diner door. He didn't go in. He didn't walk away. He just stood there. Donna brought Margaret's coffee and set it down without breaking stride. "Buckwheat pancakes this morning. We've got blueberries fresh." "In a moment," Margaret said, still watching the man outside. Donna followed her gaze. "Oh, him. He's been out there about 10 minutes already, before you came in." 10 minutes, Margaret repeated. "Yep, just standing. I figured he was on the phone or something, but..." Donna shrugged. "I don't know. Earl was going to go out and ask if he needed anything, but you know Earl." Margaret knew Earl. Earl, the short-order cook, had the social grace of a fence post. "He looks hungry," Margaret said. "Honey, I can't tell that from here." "I can," Margaret said simply, and she lifted her coffee. Outside, the man's name was Calvin Reyes, 58 years old, former Army mechanic. 2 tours came back different, the way they all came back different. Just each one different in his own particular way. He'd spent the last decade and a half riding. Not touring, not for pleasure, just riding, because when you were moving, the noise in your head was manageable, and when you stopped, it came back like a wave hitting a seawall. He had $43 in his wallet. He had been riding since 4 in the morning. He had not eaten since noon the day before. He knew standing there that if he went inside and ate, he would have maybe $20 left, and $20 needed to get him to Savannah, where his sister lived and where he was going because she had called him 3 weeks ago and said something he hadn't been able to stop hearing since, "Calvin, I'm sick. It's bad. Please come." He hadn't answered the call immediately. That was the thing eating at him now. The thing that had been eating at him since he'd finally called her back and heard how her voice had changed in 3 weeks, how it had gone from worried to something quieter, more careful the way a voice sounds when it is already beginning to accept something it doesn't want to accept. He'd ridden through the night. He stood outside the diner and did the math he'd been doing since Memphis, and the math didn't change no matter how many times he ran it. He turned away from the door and sat down on the concrete curb beside his motorcycle, forearms on his knees, head lowered. He wasn't crying. Calvin Reyes had not cried in a very long time, but something in him was pressing against a door that he had kept locked for years, and he could feel the pressure of it now there on that curb in that parking lot on a Tuesday morning in October. Inside the diner, Margaret Holloway set down her coffee cup. "Donna," she said. Donna appeared with the coffee pot. "More already." "No, I need you to do something for me." Donna tilted her head. In 11 years, she could count on one hand the number of times Margaret had asked anyone to do anything for her. The woman was constitutionally self-sufficient in a way that made other people feel vaguely embarrassed about how much they asked for help. "I need you to bring me the full breakfast plate," Margaret said. "Eggs, bacon, pancakes, the works? Toast? Orange juice?" Donna blinked. "Miss Maggie, you always just get the—" "I know what I always get. I want the full breakfast plate. And I want a large orange juice, and whatever the most filling thing on the lunch menu is, I want that wrapped to go." Donna stared at her for a moment. "That's a lot of food." "Yes, it is." Margaret opened her purse, a small black leather purse she'd had since 1988, and counted out some bills onto the table. "That should cover it and keep whatever's left." "Miss Maggie, I still don't—" "The man outside," Margaret said quietly. "He's hungry and he doesn't want to come in, which means he doesn't have enough money to feel comfortable coming in, which means he's embarrassed. And the last thing an embarrassed man needs is someone making him more embarrassed by asking questions. So you're going to take that food outside and you're going to tell him it was ordered and the customer couldn't stay. Can you do that?" Donna opened her mouth, closed it, looked out the window at the man sitting on the curb. "Yeah," she said softly. "Yeah, I can do that." "Good girl," Margaret said and picked up her menu. Calvin heard footsteps and looked up. The waitress, round-faced, tired-looking, kind eyes, was walking toward him, carrying a tray covered with more food than he had seen in a single meal in months. Eggs, bacon, a short stack of pancakes with syrup on the side, orange juice in a tall glass, toast, and a brown paper bag that smelled like something warm and substantial. He stood up automatically the way men of a certain background stand up when someone approaches. "Can I help you?" he said, and it came out more guarded than he meant it. "Actually, I'm hoping I can help you," Donna said. She stopped a few feet away, the tray held steady, her voice careful and deliberate, the way someone's voice gets when they're delivering a rehearsed message and trying to make it sound unrehearsed. "We had a customer order all this, and then she realized she had to leave doctor's appointment. It happens all the time, and it would just go to waste otherwise. You'd be doing us a favor." Calvin looked at the food, he looked at Donna, he looked back at the food. "I don't need charity," he said, and the way he said it, flat, not angry, just flat, made it clear this was not new territory for him. This exchange, this particular negotiation of pride versus need. Donna didn't flinch. "It's not charity, sir. It's leftover food that I am going to throw away in 30 seconds if you don't take it. And I hate throwing away food. My mama raised me in a house where you didn't waste food, and I still hear about it every time I scrape something into the trash." Something moved across Calvin's face. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "You're a bad liar," he said. Donna blinked. "Excuse me?" "The story, it's not bad, but—" He looked at the tray again. "Nobody orders pancakes and eggs in a to-go bag and then just leaves." Donna stood very still. Then she sighed. "Okay, fair enough. There's a lady inside who saw you sitting out here, and, I don't want to hear it," Calvin said, and his voice had gone flat again. that particular flatness that was its own form of armor. "Tell her thank you, but I'm fine." He turned back toward his motorcycle. "She's 96 years old," Donna said. Calvin stopped. "She walks in here every Tuesday at 7:15. Donna continued, her voice steady now, no longer performing but just talking. "She sits in the same booth. She orders the same coffee. She's been doing it for 11 years, ever since her husband passed. And I have never, not once, seen her ask anyone to do anything like this for anyone." Calvin didn't turn around. "She saw you sitting out here and she said you looked hungry," Donna said. "She didn't make a big thing of it. She didn't come out here herself and make you feel like a project. She just wanted to make sure you ate." The morning air was very still. "Why?" Calvin said, and the word came out stripped of everything. No armor, no flatness, just the bare question underneath. Donna hesitated. "I don't know. She didn't say." He stood there for another long moment. Then he turned around slowly and looked at the tray. "Set it on the curb," he said finally. "I'll eat out here." Donna set the tray down on the wide, flat curb with the steadiness of someone who had been carrying heavy things her whole life, and then she stood up and looked at him. "You're welcome," she said quietly. He sat back down beside the tray. He didn't say anything. He picked up the fork. Inside the diner, Margaret watched him through the window. She watched him eat, not with desperation, but with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who was forcing himself to slow down, who understood that this meal had to last him. She watched him pick up the orange juice and hold it for a moment before drinking it. She watched his shoulders, which had been drawn up tight since she first saw him, begin to drop slightly incrementally, the way a drawn bow releases when you ease the tension. "He took it," Donna said, appearing beside her. "Of course he did," Margaret said. "He needed to. He knew it wasn't a real story about the customer leaving. Of course he did." Margaret smiled very slightly at the window. "Smart man." Donna slid into the opposite side of the booth, an impulse she immediately questioned. You didn't just sit down with Margaret Holloway, but Margaret didn't tell her to leave. "Can I ask you something?" Donna said. "You can try and why him?" "I mean," Donna gestured vaguely. "We see people in rough spots all the time. Travelers, people passing through. You've never—" "I know," Margaret said. "So why him?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Her eyes stayed on the window. Outside, Calvin was working through the pancakes, now methodically, one deliberate bite at a time. "He reminds me of someone," she said finally. "Who?" Margaret picked up her coffee. "My son," she said. The word landed between them like something dropped from a height. Donna didn't say anything. "Robert," Margaret said, and the name was careful in her mouth, handled like something fragile. "He died in 2001. He was 54 years old." She paused. "He used to ride a motorcycle. His father hated it. I never told him that I thought it was wonderful, the riding, I mean. The freedom of it." Her voice didn't break, but it moved the way water moves when something passes through it. "I never told him a lot of things. You think you have time. You always think you have time." Donna felt something tighten in her chest. "And then one day you don't," Donna said softly. "And then one day you don't," Margaret agreed. Outside, Calvin finished the eggs and set the fork down. He reached for the brown paper bag, the to-go box, and held it in both hands. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at the diner window. The morning sun was coming in low and sideways, throwing long shadows across the lot. Through the glass in the corner booth, he could see a small, white-haired woman sitting very straight, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking out at him. He didn't know why, but he held up one hand. A wave. Small, simple. Inside, Margaret raised one hand in return. And then something happened in Calvin Reyes that he could not have explained to anyone, least of all himself. Something in that small gesture, the arc of her tiny wrist, the steadiness of that raised hand, landed somewhere deep and unexpected. Somewhere he had buried under 37 years of distance and motion and noise. He put the to-go bag down. He stood up. He walked to the diner door. The broken bell chimed. He stepped inside, and the warmth and the smell of coffee and bacon and something older than both of those things wrapped around him like a physical thing. Every head in the diner turned. Calvin Reyes was not the kind of man people looked away from quickly. He stood in the doorway for a moment, too large, too road-worn, too obviously out of place in the gentle domesticity of the Bluebell Diner on a Tuesday morning, and he looked at the corner booth. The white-haired woman looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. Then Margaret Holloway, 96 years old, 4 feet 11 inches, 2 bobby pins, gestured to the empty seat across from her. Calvin crossed the diner. He sat down, and Donna, watching from behind the counter, felt the specific, irreversible sensation of witnessing something that was going to matter, though she couldn't yet have said why or how much. "Thank you," Calvin said. His voice up close was rougher than she'd expected, textured by years and roads, and probably by things he would never say out loud. "You're welcome," Margaret said, "though we both know you don't entirely believe it was an accident." "No," he said, "I don't." "Good," she said. "I don't like dishonesty." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and something in the directness of her gaze, the absolute lack of performance in it, stopped something in him. "I'm Calvin," he said. "Margaret," she said, "but people call me Miss Maggie, and you may do the same if you like." "How old are you?" he said, and it came out before he could stop it, blunt and unguarded. She didn't seem to mind. 96 years, 3 months, and she tilted her head slightly, calculating. 17 days. Calvin stared at her. "And you're sitting here alone?" "I sit here alone every Tuesday," she said. "I prefer it." "Then why?" He stopped, gestured toward the window, toward where he'd been sitting on the curb. "Because there's a difference," she said, "between choosing to be alone and being alone because you don't think you're worth the company." The diner carried on around them. Coffee, poured plates, moved the low murmur of other conversations. But between Calvin Reyes and Margaret Holloway, something had gone very still. He looked down at the table. "What makes you think—" "You sat outside," she said simply, "in the cold for at least 10 minutes, looking at the door." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You weren't on the phone. You weren't enjoying the morning air. You were trying to decide whether you were worth a hot meal." The muscles along Calvin's jaw shifted. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I have somewhere to be. I was just figuring out the math." "The math," she repeated. "Money," he said. "I have enough to eat or enough to get where I'm going, not quite both." "Where are you going?" And he was quiet for a moment. "Savannah," he said. "My sister. She's—" He stopped. And in that pause, that caught breath, Margaret heard everything that wasn't being said, and it landed in her chest with a weight she recognized intimately. "She's sick," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Calvin looked up at her. "Yeah," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "She is." Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer the standard consolation, the reflexive sorry for your troubles that people offered the way they offered a business card, something to fill the space, to make the giver feel they'd done something. She just nodded. And that simple weightless nod that asked nothing and assumed nothing broke something open in Calvin Reyes that he had been keeping shut for a very long time. "I didn't go right away," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, just barely, just enough. "When she called, I had stuff I had—" He stopped, pressed one hand flat against the table. "I waited 3 weeks, and now I don't know if—" He shook his head. "I don't know." The diner hummed around them. "Calvin," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Drive fast," she said. The simplicity of it hit him somewhere between the sternum and the throat. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "Whatever else you're carrying, the guilt, the what-ifs, the 3 weeks, that is a conversation you can have with yourself on the road. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting there." She paused. "Can your motorcycle make it?" "Yeah," he said reflexively. Then more honestly, "I think so. It's been making a sound for the last 50 miles. "What kind of sound?" He blinked. "You know motorcycles." "My son had one," she said. "I learned enough to worry about the right things." Something moved across Calvin's face, a complicated motion like a shadow passing over water. "What kind of sound?" she repeated. "A knock," he said. "Low, intermittent. Could be, the chain could be, I don't know. Could be something else. Is there a mechanic in this town you'd trust?" "I don't know anyone in this town. I've never been here before." "I know someone," she said, and the certainty in her voice made it sound like something that had been decided long before this morning. "His name is Frank Holt. He's retired, but he's still the best mechanic in 50 miles, and he owes me a favor." She paused, considering. Several, actually. Calvin stared at her. You're serious, he said. Don't say things I don't mean, she said. At 96, I don't have the time. The sound that came out of Calvin then was something he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. Low and sudden and involuntary. Not quite a laugh, not quite a... Donna behind the counter looked up. Margaret held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had survived things that would have unmade a lesser person, and she did not look away. Why are you doing this? Calvin said, and his voice was stripped to nothing now. No armor, no performance, just the bare, bewildered question of a man who had spent so long being invisible that being seen felt like a kind of violence. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the words. The words that Donna would repeat to her husband that night. The words that Calvin Reyes would carry in his chest for the rest of his life, pulling them out in the quiet moments, turning them over, finding new weight in them each time. You look exactly like my son, she said. Her voice was steady, unhurried. He died alone. He was too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to let anyone in, and I didn't push hard enough. She held his gaze. Nobody sat with him. The diner continued to exist around them. Coffee cups clinked. Somewhere a child laughed. The broken bell chimed as someone left. Calvin Reyes did not move. He sat very still, and every wall he had built, every mile of road and silence and forward motion he had used to keep himself sealed against the world cracked along a fault line he hadn't known was there. I'm not your son, he said, and his voice broke completely on the last word. No, Margaret said gently, but you're someone's, and you're going to make it to Savannah. And you're going to sit with your sister, and you're going to wet there. Her eyes, dark and clear, and so much older than everything else in the room, held him without pity, without performance. Just held him. Do you understand me? Calvin Reyes, 58 years old, former Army mechanic, a man who had not cried in 37 years, nodded. And then quietly, without making a production of it, without warning or apology, he put his face in his hands. And Margaret Holloway sat across from him and did not look away and did not speak and did not move to comfort him with anything as small as a touch, because some things need their full space. And she was old enough to know that she was old enough to know exactly what to give and what to leave alone. Outside, the morning continued. Inside booth 6 of the Bluebell Diner, something was being put back together that had been broken for a very long time. And neither of them knew yet that before this Tuesday was over, the story would grow into something neither of them could have planned. Something that would reach beyond Clover Falls, beyond Savannah, beyond the two of them entirely into the lives of people they hadn't yet met, carrying with it the specific, unrepeatable weight of a 96-year-old woman who looked out of the window and decided that a stranger on a curb was worth more than a moment's consideration. But all of that was still ahead. Right now, there was just this, a cup of coffee going cold a man, with his face in his hands, and a woman who had decided on a Tuesday morning in October that the math of kindness was the only math worth doing. Nobody in the Bluebell Diner made a sound. That was the thing Donna remembered most afterward. Not what was said, not even the image of the big man with his face in his hands, but the silence. The way the whole diner had gone quiet without anyone deciding to go quiet, the way conversations simply stopped, the way forks were set down and coffee cups were held midair, and everyone just waited. As if the room itself understood that something real was happening and had the decency to make space for it. Calvin pulled his hands away from his face after a long moment. He didn't wipe his eyes. He just sat there, jaw set, looking at the table, breathing through his nose, slowly the way a man breathes when he is deciding who he is going to be in the next 30 seconds. Margaret did not fill the silence. She understood, and this was the product of 96 years of hard-earned understanding that certain silences are not empty. They are full, fuller than any words you could press into them. And the most important thing you can do with a full silence is leave it alone. Calvin looked up finally. His eyes were red at the edges, but steady. I'm sorry, he said. Don't, she said. I don't usually with Calvin. Her voice was very even. Don't apologize for being human. I've had enough of men apologizing for being human to last me 3 lifetimes. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, something older and more complicated than a smile. Your husband, he said, among others, she said dryly, and that the dryness, the lightness of it, the unexpected humor dropping into the middle of all that weight, made Calvin exhale in a way that Wasn't quite a laugh, but moved through his body the same way a laugh does releasing something. Tell me about her, Margaret said. Yeah, your sister. Yeah, he looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She picked up her coffee, which was by now completely cold, and drank it without making a face. I want to. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, her name is Rosa. She's 53. She's the good one, you know. Like there are families where one person just came out right, came out with all the patience and all the warmth and none of the, he gestured vaguely at himself. None of whatever this is. You seem to have done all right, Margaret said. I've survived, he said. That's different. He spread his hands flat on the table looking at them, large hands scarred in the particular way of someone who had worked with metal and heat for a long time. Rosa's got a kid, a daughter Lily, she's 12, and Rosa raised her alone because her husband left when Lily was 4, and she never said a bad word about him, not once, not where Lily could hear it. Who does that? Who's that? He stopped, shook his head. And now she's sick, and Lily's 12 years old, and she's going to... He stopped again abruptly like a man who walked to the edge of something and stepped back. She's going to need someone, Margaret said quietly. Calvin nodded, his jaw worked. That's why you're going, Margaret said. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't praise, it was just the truth laid flat on the table between them. Yeah, Calvin said. Yeah, that's why. He looked out the window toward his motorcycle, toward the road toward Savannah. I should have gone the second she called. I know that. I had a job. I was in the middle of a contract job in Memphis, and I told myself I'd finish the week and then go, and then the week became 2 weeks, and he pressed his lips together. 3 weeks. And now you're here, Margaret said. Not in Memphis, here. Yeah. So you went, she said. Late, he said. Late, she agreed, but you went. She set her coffee cup down with a small, definitive sound. Calvin, I have spent 50 years carrying the weight of things I did too late or not at all. And I can tell you with complete certainty that there is no profit in it. The weight doesn't get lighter with time. It just gets more familiar. And familiar is not the same as bearable. She looked at him steadily. What you can change right now is how fast you get there. Everything else is a conversation for another day. He stared at her for a long moment. Are you always like this, he said. Like what? This, he searched for the word. Direct. I'm 96 years old, she said. What exactly am I saving it for? This time he did laugh, short and genuine and surprised out of him, the kind of laugh that arrives before you can decide whether you feel like laughing. And Donna behind the counter heard it and felt something in her chest unknot very slightly. Okay, Calvin said. Okay. He took a breath. You mentioned a mechanic. Frank Holt, Margaret confirmed. He lives 8 minutes from here. He will look at your motorcycle this morning, and he will not charge you. Calvin shook his head. Miss Maggie, I can't have you calling in favors for a stranger. The favor, she said calmly, is mine to call in. Frank Holt's youngest son failed his driving test 6 times. 6. The boy had the spatial reasoning of a golden retriever. I tutored him for 4 months in this booth every Saturday morning until he passed. Frank has been insisting on owing me something ever since. Consider it done. Calvin looked at her. You tutored someone for 4 months. For free. For coffee, she said. Donna kept my cup full. It was a reasonable arrangement. He shook his head slowly. Who are you? Oemas? It wasn't a rhetorical question. He meant it the way people mean it when someone confounds every category they had prepared for them. Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm a woman who has been alive long enough to know that most of what people call impossible is really just inconvenient, she said. And I don't have much patience for inconvenience. Calvin opened his mouth to respond, and that was when the door opened and everything changed. The broken bell chimed, and a man walked in mid-60s, compact and wiry, wearing a canvas jacket and a baseball cap with a logo for a hardware store that had closed down 10 years ago. He had the particular kind of face that was difficult to age, precisely the kind that had been weathered into something permanent and final. His eyes moved across the diner quickly and landed on booth 6 with the accuracy of someone who had been told exactly where to look. His name was Gary Purcell, and he stopped when he saw Calvin Reyes. That your bike outside, Gary said. His voice was flat, not hostile exactly, but not warm. Calvin turned in his seat slowly. He looked Gary up and down with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent time in situations where reading someone quickly mattered. Yeah, he said. Gary came closer. He stopped 3 feet from the booth and pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, turned the screen to face outward, and held it up. On the screen was a photograph. Margaret leaned slightly forward, adjusting her glasses. Calvin went very still. The photograph showed a motorcycle, Calvin's motorcycle, the specific make and model, and you could see in the background of the photo the entrance ramp to the interstate, which meant the photo had been taken this morning before he'd pulled off into Clover Falls. And there was a figure beside the bike that was clearly Calvin, taken from a distance from a car window, by the look of it. "Where'd you get that?" Calvin said. His voice had gone completely flat. "Friend of mine sent it," Gary said. "He saw you on the 75 this morning." He lowered the phone. He recognized the bike. The diner had gone quiet again. "Lots of bikes that look like mine," Calvin said. "Not with that scratch on the tank," Gary said. "Big one, left side, diagonal." Calvin did not move. He was thinking very fast. Margaret could see it, the eyes shifting slightly, recalculating. "What do you want?" Calvin said. Gary was quiet for a beat too long, the kind of pause that has weight in it. Then he said, "Are you Calvin Reyes?" And the way he said the name, not like a question, like a confirmation, made Margaret's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. "Who's asking?" Calvin said. "My name is Gary Purcell," the man said. "My brother was Dennis Purcell. I think you knew him." The blood left Calvin Reyes's face. It was not a gradual thing. It was fast and complete, the way color leaves something when it's been shocked, and Margaret watched it happen and understood immediately that this, whatever this was not small. "Dennis," Calvin said. The name came out like he was lifting something heavy. "He died 14 months ago," Gary said. "Liver failure." There was no emotion in the delivery. It was surgical. "He told me about you before he died, told me a lot of things. Said if I ever ran into you, I should—" He stopped. And here something moved across his face that wasn't anger and wasn't grief exactly, but lived somewhere in the territory between the two. "He said I should tell you that he never blamed you." The silence that followed that sentence was unlike anything that had been in the diner that morning. Calvin put both hands flat on the table. "You drove here to tell me that?" Calvin said. "I didn't drive here," Gary said. "I live here. I've lived here for 20 years. I work at the machine shop on Clover Road." He put his phone back in his pocket. "I was having breakfast at home when Tommy called me and said he saw your bike, and I got in my car and drove to the diner." He pulled out the chair at the end of the booth, not asking, just doing it, and sat down. Margaret watched all of this with the stillness of someone who has learned over the course of a very long life that the most important thing you can do in a room where something large is happening is take up very little space. "What do you want from me?" Calvin said again. His voice was different now. The flatness was gone, and what had replaced it was something rawer and more frightened, which surprised Margaret because he hadn't struck her as someone who frightened easily. "Nothing," Gary said. "Dennis specifically said not to go looking for you. He said you'd surface eventually." He paused. "He said when you see him, just tell him I didn't blame him, and tell him to stop running." Calvin looked at the table. "What happened between you and Dennis?" Margaret said. Both men looked at her, apparently having forgotten for a moment that she was there. Gary blinked. "Ma'am, this is kind of a private—" "Nothing in this booth is private," Margaret said pleasantly. "Donna, for example, has heard everything I have said in booth 6 for 11 years. I have no secrets left." And she looked at Calvin. "This young man and I were in the middle of something, so I'd appreciate knowing whether this is connected or whether we need to reschedule." Gary stared at her. "Who are you, Graham?" "Margaret Holloway. I bought him breakfast." She said it the way you say the sky is blue. "Now, what happened between you and Dennis?" Calvin looked up. His eyes met Margaret's and held them for a moment. And then slowly he said, "Dennis was my unit in the Army. He was my unit and he was my friend." And he stopped. He turned his head away. "And I wasn't there when he needed me. Same way I wasn't there when Rosa called." He said it with a quiet, flat self-condemnation that was worse than anger. "Apparently it's what I do." "That's not what Dennis said," Gary said sharply. "That is not what he told me." "What did he tell you?" Gary leaned forward slightly. He said you saved his life in 2003. He said you made a call that nobody else had the guts to make, and it got 3 men home who otherwise wouldn't have come home. And he said that after you came back, you disappeared because you couldn't live with the men who didn't make it, not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much. He paused. He said that was your problem. You cared too much and had no way to put it anywhere. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Calvin's throat moved. He always talked too much, he said, and his voice was barely audible. Yeah, Gary said. He did. A beat of silence that was almost comfortable, the way silence between people who have been introduced to each other through grief can sometimes be unexpectedly. Then Gary reached into his jacket pocket again, and this time pulled out a small envelope, white, slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been carried for a while. He set it on the table between them. He wrote you a letter, Gary said, about a year before he died. He asked me to make sure you got it if I ever found you. He looked at the envelope, then back at Calvin. I've been carrying it for 14 months. Calvin stared at the envelope. He didn't touch it. Margaret watched his hands, both still flat on the table, pressing down, as if anchoring himself. I don't know if I can, Calvin started. You don't have to read it now, Gary said. He pushed it slightly closer. But take it. And this was the moment, this small, undramatic push of an envelope across a diner table that cracked something open in the room. Not loudly, not with any ceremony, just the slow, irreversible sound of something giving way. Calvin picked up the envelope. He held it in both hands and he looked at it, and Margaret saw on his face an expression she recognized from the deepest, most private part of her own memory, the expression of someone holding something they both desperately want and desperately fear, because once you open it, the world before the opening is gone. Thank you, Calvin said to Gary. His voice had lost all its edges. Gary nodded. He stood up from the table. He looked like he wanted to say something else, turned it over for a moment, then let it go. I'm sorry about your sister, he said. I heard you mention Savannah. I hope he stopped. I hope she's okay. And then he walked out. The bell chimed. Margaret and Calvin sat in the booth 6, and the envelope sat between them on the table, and the diner continued to exist around them, with its coffee and its grease and its broken bell and its ordinary Tuesday morning life, completely indifferent to the fact that in booth 6, a man was holding 20 years of unfinished grief in a white envelope, and a 96-year-old woman was deciding whether to speak or to let the silence do its work. She let the silence do its work. For almost 2 full minutes, neither of them said anything. Then Calvin said, "Did you ever get a letter from someone you'd lost?" Margaret thought about this seriously. Yes, she said. My husband wrote me a letter. Before he died, he gave it to our neighbor with instructions to mail it the day after the funeral. She paused. The neighbor forgot for 6 months. Calvin looked at her. What happened? I got it on a Tuesday, she said. In this booth, actually. Donna brought it in with the mail she was bringing to Earl. The faint curve at the corner of her mouth was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. It was the most like him it was possible to be, that letter. He spent 3 paragraphs apologizing for things that didn't need apologizing for, and 1 sentence saying everything that mattered. What was the 1 sentence? Calvin said. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something. He said, you were always the bravest thing I knew, and I never said it enough, and I am saying it now so the record is straight. She paused. Henry was not a man given to sentiment, so when it came like a freight train. Calvin's eyes were very bright. Read yours, she said, quietly, firmly, the way she said everything. Not yet, he said. All right. When I get to Savannah, he said. When I'm with Rosa, I'll read it then. Margaret nodded. That's a good idea, she said. And she meant it not as consolation, but as genuine agreement. Some things needed witnesses. Some things needed to be read in the presence of the people who anchored you to the living world. Calvin put the envelope inside his jacket against his chest. He straightened up. Something had changed in the set of his shoulders. It wasn't lighter exactly. It was more like something had been redistributed, the weight still there, but balanced differently. You should call Frank, Margaret said. Right, he said. He looked at her. How do you do this? Do what? Know exactly what someone needs. She was quiet for a moment. I don't always, she said honestly. I've been wrong plenty of times. I've pushed when I should have waited and waited when I should have pushed. She straightened the sugar packets in their little holder, an automatic gesture, something to do with her hands. But I'm old enough to know that most of the time, people don't need much. They need someone to look at them, really look, not pretend to look, and say, I see you and you're not invisible, and you matter enough for me to stop my Tuesday morning and care. She looked at him. That's almost always enough. Calvin looked at this woman, this tiny, immovable, clear-eyed woman, and something in him that had been moving constantly for 15 years, that had kept moving because stopping felt too much like dying, went still. Just for a moment, just long enough to take a breath. Let me call Frank, Margaret said, and reached for her phone. What neither of them knew in that moment, what neither of them could have known, because the day was still young, and the road to Savannah was long, and the envelope against Calvin's chest was still sealed, was that Frank Holt's garage held something that would change the course of Calvin's trip entirely. Not the motorcycle, not the mechanical problem. Something left behind by someone who had been there before him. Something that had been waiting without anyone knowing it was waiting for exactly this day. But first Margaret had to make the call. Margaret's phone call to Frank Holt lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Calvin counted, not because he was impatient, but because he had nothing to do with his hands, and counting was something to do that wasn't thinking about the envelope pressed against his chest. He heard her side of the conversation. It was not a conversation so much as a series of declarations interrupted by what he assumed were protests. Each protest meeting a response so calm and so final that the protest simply dissolved. Frank, I need you to look at a motorcycle this morning. Pause. I understand you're retired, Frank. You've been retired for 6 years and you still have grease under your fingernails, so let's not pretend. Pause. His name is Calvin. He's a friend of mine. He needs to get to Savannah by tonight. Pause. The favor from Tommy's driving test, yes. Consider this it. Pause. Frank. One word, absolute. The way a period ends a sentence. Thank you. We'll be there in 10 minutes. She set the phone down. He said yes, she said. I got that impression, Calvin said. He also said he's in the middle of something and it might take a while and he can't promise anything. She picked up her purse, which means he'll have it done in an hour. He always undersells himself. Henry was the same way. Calvin looked at her. You're coming. She met his look with mild surprise, as if the alternative hadn't occurred to her. I called in the favor, she said simply. I'll see it through. Donna appeared at the table before Calvin could respond. She had her coat on over her uniform and her car keys in her hand and an expression on her face that dared either of them to say something about it. I'm driving you both, Donna said. Miss Maggie doesn't drive and your bike isn't running right, and I've got 30 minutes before the breakfast rush really kicks in, and Earl can handle it alone for 30 minutes because if he can't after 22 years, then I've been carrying him this whole time for nothing. She said this entire thing in one breath. Calvin and Margaret looked at each other. All right, Calvin said. Fine, said Margaret, but I want to stop at the register first. I'm not leaving without paying. Miss Maggie, it's on the Donna. The same tone she'd used with Frank. End of sentence, paragraph, chapter. Donna sighed and led the way to the register. Calvin stood and reached into his wallet. Margaret put her hand out and stopped him without touching him, just the gesture small and firm like a stop sign appearing from nowhere. Put that away, she said. Miss Maggie, you're going to need that in Savannah, she said. For Rosa, for Lily, put it away. He looked at her hand, the fine-boned, spotted, unsteady hand held out in the air between them with complete conviction, and he put the wallet away. They walked out together into the sharp October morning. Frank Holt's garage was a converted space behind his house on Alderman Road, the kind of place that announced itself by smell before you arrived, oil and metal and rubber, and the particular dry warmth of a space heater that has been running for hours. Frank himself was waiting in the driveway when Donna's car pulled up, arms crossed, baseball cap low, looking like a man who had agreed to something and was already reconsidering. He was 71. He had the hands of a man 40 years younger and a body that had begun very loudly disagreeing with his ambitions. He had been the best mechanic in Clover Falls from 1978 until he retired in 2018, which was a span of 40 years during which he had developed opinions about almost everything mechanical and about most things non-mechanical as well. He looked at Calvin's motorcycle, which Donna had followed slowly in her car, while Calvin rode it the 8 minutes to Alderman Road. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Calvin. You rode this from Memphis? Yes, sir, Calvin said. In the dark. Started around 4 a.m. Frank made a sound that communicated a very complete opinion without using any words. It's been knocking, Calvin said. I can see why it's been knocking, Frank said. He crouched down beside the bike with the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose knees had filed a formal complaint. Your drive chain is so loose, it's a miracle it didn't throw itself off on the interstate. Your front brake cable is fraying, you've got maybe 20% of the tension you should have. And your left exhaust bracket is cracked, which is probably why it sounds like a percussion instrument. He stood back up with slightly more difficulty than he'd crouched. Other than that, it's fine. Calvin stared at him. How far is Savannah? Frank said to no one in particular. About 280 miles, Donna said. Frank looked at Calvin. Son, you would not have made it to the county line. The air went out of Calvin the way air goes out of something punctured, sudden complete. He looked at the motorcycle, then at Frank, then at the road, the instinct to argue running straight into the wall of the fact that Frank was right. He could feel it had been wrong. He'd been feeling it for 50 miles and telling himself it would hold. How long to fix it, he said. Frank sucked his teeth. Chain cable bracket, parts I've got, labor. He looked at Margaret with an expression of profound and resigned affection. 2 hours, maybe less. Less, Margaret said. Probably less, Frank agreed. Go inside. Maria made coffee. Calvin started to follow Frank toward the garage and then stopped. He turned around. Margaret and Donna were standing together by Donna's car. And something about the way they were standing, the older woman upright and exact, the younger one round-shouldered and tired, but present, both of them completely unhurried. Completely, there hit Calvin somewhere he didn't expect. Why are you both doing this? He said. Donna looked at her keys. Margaret looked at him. Donna's doing it because she's a good person who pretends to be more tired than she is, Margaret said. I'm doing it because I have nowhere more important to be, and this is the most useful I've felt on a Tuesday in some time. Donna laughed short in surprise. That's true, that's accurate, she said. Calvin shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they've run out of the proper category for something. Then he turned and followed Frank into the garage. Inside, the warmth, the smell, the organized clutter of a man who thought better with his hands, Frank was already moving with the efficiency of someone who hadn't actually stopped being a mechanic, just stopped being paid to be one. He had the chain off in 6 minutes. He didn't talk while he worked, and Calvin stood off to the side and watched and felt the specific relief of being in the presence of competence. You were Army, Twee, Frank said, not a question. How'd you know? The way you came through that door, Frank said. You checked the corners. He glanced up. I was Marines. 72 to 76. Different animal, same instinct. Calvin nodded. They were quiet for a moment in the way that men who have shared certain categories of experience are sometimes quiet, not empty quiet, but the quiet of people who don't need to explain the shorthand. Maggie tell you about Robert, Frank said. Calvin looked at him. Her son, a little. Robert was a good kid, Frank said, attention back on the chain. Came in here when he was 17, wanted to learn about bikes. His father thought it was a waste of time. Robert didn't care. He worked steadily. He and I worked on that bike together in this garage for about 6 months. He got pretty good. A pause. When he died, she came to me and asked if I still had any of his tools. He'd left a few things here. I'd kept them in a box because I didn't know what else to do. Frank set down one tool and picked up another. She told me to keep them, said she couldn't look at them yet. That was 23 years ago. Calvin felt something tighten in his chest. She never came back for them, he said. Frank was quiet for a beat. She never asked about them again, he said, until this morning. Calvin went very still. Frank didn't look up. He was working on the brake cable now, his hands steady and practiced. When she called me at the end of the call, she said, and I want to get this right because she said it specific. She said, Frank, if there's anything of Robert's still there, I'd like Calvin to have whatever's useful. The garage was very quiet. She said that, Calvin said. Verbatim, Frank said. Calvin turned away toward the garage door, toward the driveway, where he could see the two women talking by the car, Donna gesturing about something, Margaret listening with her head slightly tilted. He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment. He had known her for what, an hour and a half, 2 hours? This woman who had looked out a window and seen a stranger on a curb and decided without deliberation, without agenda to feed him, and then to sit with him, and then to call in a favor, and then to come along, and now to give him pieces of a dead son she had been holding at arm's length for 23 years. "Where's the box?" Calvin said. His voice was steady. "Barely." Frank pointed with his chin toward a metal shelving unit against the wall. "Second shelf from the top." A cardboard box with Robert written on the side in black marker in handwriting that was unmistakably Margaret's precise, slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship in a time when penmanship was treated as a form of character. Calvin walked to the shelf. He stood in front of the box for a moment without touching it. Then he reached up and took it down carefully, the way you carry something fragile, even though it was just a cardboard box. He set it on Frank's workbench and opened it. Inside, a pair of mechanic's gloves worn to the shape of the hands that had worn them. A small socket wrench with a piece of red tape around the handle. A folded bandana navy blue. A hand-drawn diagram of an engine rendered with surprising precision on a piece of notebook paper yellowed at the edges, the handwriting on it young and careful. And under all of that, a photograph. Calvin picked it up. A young man, early 20s, dark-haired, laughing at something off-camera, sitting astride a motorcycle with the casual confidence of someone who had just figured something out. And standing beside him, one hand resting on the bike, her posture exactly as it was today, except her hair was dark and her face was unlined, Margaret. Looking not at the camera but at her son, with an expression Calvin could only describe as pure and uncomplicated joy. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put it in his jacket pocket, next to Dennis's letter. Frank looked over from the bike. He saw where Calvin's hand was. He didn't say anything. He went back to work. "She loved him," Calvin said, not really to Frank, to the room. "With everything she had," Frank said quietly, "and she's giving me his things." Frank set down his wrench. He turned to look at Calvin properly for the first time. "Son," he said, "I have known Margaret Holloway for 40 years. I watched her bury her husband. I watched her bury her son. I watched her sit in that diner booth every Tuesday for 11 years alone, ordering coffee she barely drinks, talking to Donna about nothing in particular, just to hear a human voice." He paused. "And in 40 years, I've never once seen her do what she did this morning. Not for anyone." Calvin held the mechanic's gloves in both hands. "She's not giving you his things because she thinks you're Robert," Frank said. "She's giving you his things because she thinks you're going to use them. Because you're going somewhere that matters and you're running on empty. And she's spent 23 years not being able to give Robert what he needed. And right now, today, she can do something." He turned back to the bike. "Let her do it." Outside, Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Donna's car because Donna had insisted, and she was looking at the garage door with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was not going to talk about. Donna sat in the driver's seat and said nothing for a few minutes, which was a genuine accomplishment for Donna, who processed the world primarily through conversation. Then she said, "Are you okay?" "I'm perfectly fine," Margaret said. "Miss Maggie." "Donna, you just gave away Robert's things." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I gave away what was useful," she said. "That's different from giving away Robert." Donna looked at her profile, the fine lines, the absolute composure, the two bobby pins. "Where'd you put him?" Donna said softly. "Robert, where do you keep him?" Margaret's hands moved in her lap, a small motion barely visible. "Same place I keep Henry," she said. "Same place I keep everything that doesn't have anywhere left to go." She looked at the garage door. "You build a room for it, inside, and you keep it furnished. And sometimes you open the door and stand in it for a while, and then you close it and you go have coffee." Donna felt her eyes sting. "That is the saddest and most functional thing I have ever heard," she said. And Margaret, 96 years old, 4 feet 11, 2 bobby pins, made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Small and real and sudden, like something caught her off guard. "Henry used to say I was the most functional woman he'd ever met," she said. "He didn't always mean it as a compliment." Donna laughed, too wet-eyed and helpless. And for a moment, the car was full of it. That particular laughter that lives right next to grief and sometimes tips into it and sometimes doesn't, and this time didn't. Inside the garage, Frank was finishing up. Calvin was sitting on an overturned crate with Robert's engine diagram in his hands, looking at the young handwriting, The careful labels, the small drawing in the corner of what appeared to be a motorcycle seen from above, rendered with the dedicated inaccuracy of someone who loved what they were drawing more than they were skilled at drawing it. He was smart, Calvin said. You can tell, and brighter than his father, according to Maggie, Frank said. She said it to Howard's face once at a dinner party. He never quite recovered. Calvin started, then stopped, then tried again. She walked into that diner alone this morning, every Tuesday, by herself. Yes. That doesn't bother anyone. Nobody checks on her. Nobody. She has a son-in-law in Atlanta who calls every Sunday, Frank said. She has a neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who keeps an eye. She has Donna. He paused. And she has the Tuesday booth. He straightened up from the bike hands on his lower back. Calvin, she's not alone because no one cares. She's alone because she chooses it. Those are different things. She told me that, Calvin said, about choosing to be alone versus not thinking you were worth company. She said it to me too, Frank said. I think she figured it out the hard way. Calvin looked at the engine diagram one more time, then folded it carefully and put it in the box which he closed and set on the seat of his motorcycle to take with him. Frank tested the brake cable, ran the chain, checked the bracket. He walked the motorcycle forward, 2 feet and back, listening. He crouched, stood, walked around it once. Done, he said. Calvin looked up from the box. That was 40 minutes? Frank shrugged. Hour. It wasn't an hour. Call it an hour. Good for the ego. Frank handed him the keys. She'll get you to Savannah and back if you need it. Don't push her past 70. The bracket repair is solid, but let the weld set overnight if you can. Calvin took the keys. He looked at them in his palm. Then he reached out and shook Frank's hand, and Frank took the shake without making a ceremony of it, the way men of a certain generation accept gratitude, present, brief, sincere. Thank you, Calvin said. Thank Maggie, Frank said. This was her favor. They walked out into the driveway together. Donna got out of the car when she saw them coming. Margaret opened her door and stood one hand on the car frame, steady and unhurried, watching Calvin approach with his motorcycle keys in his hand and Robert's box on the seat. She saw the box. Something moved across her face, fast, controlled, barely perceptible. But Calvin saw it, and Frank saw it, and Donna saw it, and everyone held very still for exactly 1 second. Then Margaret said, Good. You'll need those gloves. The leather on your right grip is almost gone. Calvin stopped in front of her. He was holding the box in both arms. He was 6 feet and some inches of road-worn, army-trained, grief-carrying man, and he was looking at this 4'11" woman the way people look at things they don't have the right words for. Miss Maggie, he said. Calvin, she said. I need you to know, he stopped. His jaw worked. I need you to know that I am going to make it to Savannah, and I am going to sit with Rosa, and I am going to be there. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said, simply, completely. And I need you to know that I am going to read Dennis's letter when I get there, with Rosa, like you said, with someone who anchors you. That's exactly right, she said. He reached into the box and took out the mechanic's gloves. They were worn to the shape of hands smaller than his, but he pulled them on anyway, one then the other, and he flexed his fingers inside them and looked down at them. Something about the gesture, the putting on of a dead young man's gloves, the flex of new fingers in old leathers made Donna press her hand over her mouth. Frank looked at the sky. Margaret looked at Calvin's hands. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Robert, he had a thing for people who were too hard on themselves. He thought they were the most honest kind. And Calvin Reyes, who had not cried in 37 years until this morning and had cried once already and wasn't going to again, had made that decision, blinked twice fast and nodded. He started the motorcycle. It turned over clean. No knock. The chain was quiet. The exhaust was quiet. It sounded like something that had been fixed, which it had not just the mechanical things, but something less diagnosable, something that Frank Holt, with all his competence and all his tools, could not have touched. He looked at Margaret one more time. Same time next Tuesday, he said. And she smiled a real smile, the kind her face remembered without effort, the kind that reached everything, and she said, I'll be in booth 6. He pulled out of the driveway. Donna and Frank and Margaret stood and watched him go. The sound of the engine clean and even fading down Mullen Alderman Road toward the interstate, toward Savannah, toward Rosa, toward Lily, toward Dennis's letter and Robert's photograph, and everything that had been carried too long in silence, now riding in the open on a Tuesday in October, in the direction of something that was not yet healed, but was possibly beginning. When the sound was gone, Frank said, "Coffee, Maggie." "I've had enough coffee this morning," she said. "Tea, oh." "Now you're being practical," she said, and followed him inside. And Donna stood in the driveway alone for a moment, keys in her hand, and thought about all the things that nearly didn't happen if Margaret had looked out a different window, if Calvin had driven past without stopping, if Gary Purcell's friend hadn't been on the 75 at 4 in the morning, all the small, invisible hinges on which enormous things turn, and how most of the time we never know they're there. She got in her car. She had a breakfast rush to get back to. But she sat for just one more moment before she turned the key, looking at the empty road, and she thought some days this is what grace looks like. Not large, not announced. Just a woman in a corner booth who looked out a window at the right moment and decided it mattered. Then she started the car and drove back toward the diner, and the Tuesday continued. Calvin had been on the interstate for 40 minutes when his phone rang. He didn't answer it. He didn't answer calls while riding. That was one of the few rules he kept, without exception. One of the small disciplines that had survived everything else dissolving. But at the next exit, he pulled off, cut the engine, and looked at the screen. Rosa, his chest seized. He called back immediately, and it rang twice, and then a voice answered. That was not Rosa's. It was small and careful and 12 years old, and it said, "Uncle Calvin." "Lily." He pressed the phone harder against his ear. "Hey, baby, where's your mom?" A pause, the kind of pause a 12-year-old makes when she has been told something and is trying to figure out how much of it she's allowed to say. "She's sleeping," Lily said. "She sleeps a lot now." "I know," Calvin said. "That's okay, that's her body doing what it needs to do." "Are you coming?" Lily said. And the directness of it, no preamble, no small talk. Just the stripped-down question of a child who had learned that time was not something you could assume, hit Calvin like a hand on the chest. "I'm on my way right now," he said. "I'll be there tonight. 4, 5 hours." Another pause. "Promise?" He closed his eyes. "Promise," he said. "Okay," she said, very small. Then, "She talks about you when she's awake. She told me about when you were little. She said you used to sleep with a stuffed bear until you were 11, and you made her swear never to tell anyone." Calvin made a sound that was mortifying and involuntary. "Lily." "She said it was her favorite secret," Lily said, "because it meant you weren't always tough." He sat with that for a moment. "You tell your mom I called," he said. "Tell her I'll be there before dark." "Okay." "Okay," Lily said. Then quietly, "Uncle Calvin, don't stop again." He didn't ask how she knew he'd stopped. Kids who live with sick parents developed a particular radar for delay, for the hesitation that preceded bad news. "I won't stop," he said. He hung up and sat there for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 he counted, and then he started the motorcycle and pulled back onto the interstate and pushed the speed to exactly 70, the way Frank had told him not to exceed, and held it there. The engine ran clean, the chain was quiet, the exhaust bracket held. And riding felt different now, not like running, not like the forward motion he used to manage the noise, but like intention, like direction, like he was riding towards something instead of away from everything. The box was strapped to the back of the bike with a bungee cord Donna had produced from her trunk before he left, saying she always kept one because Earl was always forgetting something at the restaurant supply store and needing her to pick it up. The box moved slightly in the air but held. Robert's gloves were on his hands. The photograph and Dennis's letter were in his inside jacket pocket, pressed against his chest, and he could feel them both there, not literally, not physically, but the way you feel things that carry enough weight. He rode. Outside Clover Falls, Margaret Holloway sat in Frank Holt's kitchen, drinking tea she hadn't asked for and allowing it because Maria Holt, Frank's wife of 43 years, had a way of putting things in front of you that made refusal feel like an act of aggression. Maria was 70, small and sharp-eyed, with the kind of warmth that was never soft. It was active, purposeful, like heat from a good stove rather than a decorative candle. She sat across from Margaret and poured her own cup and said nothing for a while, which was unusual because Maria Holt was famously not a woman who said nothing. "He reminds you of Robert," Maria said finally. "A little," Margaret said. Frank said you gave him the box. I did. The gloves and the photograph. Maria was quiet again. She turned her cup in its saucer once, twice. I always thought you'd want that photograph, she said. I thought one day you'd come get it. I have other photographs of Robert, Margaret said. That one was better used. Better used, Maria repeated, not critically, turning the words over. You know, Howard would have hated this. Margaret's husband, Howard, had been by most accounts a man of strong opinions and limited adaptability, and Margaret had loved him fiercely and without illusion for 51 years. Howard would have hated most of what I do, she said. He spent 30 years telling me I trusted strangers too easily. Maybe he was right. He was wrong about almost everything except carpentry and tax preparation, Margaret said with the complete serenity of a woman who has had decades to arrive at an accurate assessment. He was exceptional at both. Maria laughed. Then her face went quieter. Are you all right, Maggie? Really? Margaret looked at her tea. I'm fine, Maria. It's okay if you're not. I know it is, Margaret said. I'm still fine. She set the cup down. I did what needed doing. That doesn't make me sad. That's the thing people don't understand about being my age. They think everything costs you. Some things pay you back. Maria looked at her for a long moment. What paid you back today? She said softly. Margaret was quiet. Then she said, watching him put those gloves on. And Maria, who had known Margaret Holloway for 30 years, who had seen her at Howard's funeral and at Robert's funeral and at every Tuesday in between, reached across the table and put her hand over Margaret's. And Margaret let her, which was its own kind of answer. 3 hours south on the interstate, Calvin was making good time. He stopped once for gas, not because he wanted to stop, but because the tank demanded it. And while the tank filled, he stood at the pump and looked at his phone and saw a text from a number he didn't immediately recognize. It took him a moment to place it, and then he did Gary Purcell. He must have gotten Calvin's number from Donna, or maybe from Margaret, or maybe from that specific small-town network of information that operated in places like Clover Falls without anyone acknowledging that it operated. The text said, my brother talked about you for 20 years. I just want you to know that. He talked about you the way people talk about the best thing that happened to them. Whatever you think you did wrong, that's not who you were to him. Safe travels. Calvin read it twice. He put his phone in his pocket. He paid for the West in cash, $14, and he did not permit himself to do the math on what was left in his wallet, because the math was what it was, and he was going to Savannah, and the math was not the point anymore. He was back on the road in 4 minutes. The sun had moved to afternoon by the time the Savannah city limits came up on the signs. Calvin felt a shift in his chest that happened whenever he approached a destination he'd been avoiding. The thing that had been compressed by distance now beginning to expand to take up its actual size, which was larger than the forward motion had allowed him to feel. Rosa's house was on a street called Beaumont, in a neighborhood that was not wealthy but was well kept, the kind of neighborhood where people put out their trash cans on the right day and swept their front steps and knew their neighbors' names. Calvin had never been there. Rosa had moved after her husband left into something smaller and more manageable, and Calvin had meant to visit and had not visited, and now he was turning onto Beaumont Street for the first time on a motorcycle he'd ridden from Memphis with a dead man's gloves on his hands and a dead friend's letter over his heart. He cut the engine in front of a small house with a front porch, and the sudden silence after hours of road noise was enormous. The front door opened before he got off the bike. Lily was 12, and she looked like Rosa had looked at 12, which meant she looked like their mother, which meant she had the dark eyes and the stubborn chin and the way of standing that communicated an entire position without saying a word. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and she looked at him, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, you have weird gloves. When Calvin looked down at Robert's mechanic's gloves. They're borrowed, he said. From who? It's a long story. She considered this. Mom's awake, she said. She woke up about an hour ago. I told her you called. How is she? Lily's expression did something complicated, running through several things at once, settling on honest. She's having a good day, she said carefully. Doctor, Mercer said the good days might get shorter. She said this the way you say something you've practiced, saying something you've had to repeat to yourself until you could say it without your voice doing what it wanted to do. But today is a good one. Calvin walked toward the porch. Lily stepped back to let him in, and then as he passed her, she did something that stopped him cold. She grabbed his arm, not hard, just her fingers wrapping around his jacket sleeve, and she held on for 1 second. Just 1 second. Then she let go and walked ahead of him into the house, and Calvin stood in the doorway for a moment breathing. Rosa was in the living room. She was in a recliner that was clearly new, bought for medical purpose, not an aesthetic preference, with a blanket over her lap, and her hair shorter than Calvin remembered, shorter than she would have chosen, but her eyes were the same. They had always been the same as their mother's eyes. And their mother had been gone for 20 years, and looking at Rosa was sometimes like looking at an echo of something you couldn't get back. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're late," she said. "I know," he said. 3 weeks late." "Rosa, I know." She waved her hand, dismissing it, not because it didn't matter, but because she had already decided that in the time she had, this was not where she was spending it. "Come sit down. You look like you rode all night." "Since 4 a.m. Calvin." She said his name with the specific exasperation only a younger sibling can deploy against an older one who has done something both impressive and unnecessary. "There are these things called hotels." "I was fine," he said. "You're never fine," she said. "You're always fine. You've been fine since 1989. She paused. "Sit down." He sat down on the couch across from her. Lily appeared in the doorway, watched them both for a moment, then quietly disappeared with the practiced discretion of a child who had learned to read rooms. "Tell me about the ride," Rosa said. "It's not Calvin." Her voice was quiet, but her eyes were direct. "I have been lying in this chair for 4 days, and I have watched 3 seasons of a cooking show I didn't even like before I got sick. Tell me about the ride." And he told her. He started with Memphis, with the call he'd finally returned 3 weeks late, with the long night of riding south on the 75, with the exit he'd taken without entirely deciding to take it. And then he told her about the Bluebell Diner and Booth 6 and Margaret Holloway, 96 years old, 4 feet 11, 2 bobby pins, and as he talked, Rosa's face changed. It went from the careful neutrality of someone conserving energy to something more open, more alive, her eyes following the story with the tracking attention of someone who had always been better at listening than almost anyone Calvin knew. He told her about the food on the curb, about walking through the door, about what Margaret had said, the exact words, and he watched Rosa's hand come up and press against her mouth. He told her about Gary Purcell in the envelope. He saw Rosa's eyes fill. "Dennis is gone," she said softly. She had met Dennis once years ago, but she knew what Dennis had meant. 14 months, Calvin said. She exhaled. "I'm sorry." "I know." "Did you read the letter?" Calvin reached into his jacket and took out the envelope. He turned it in his hands. "I wanted to read it here," he said, "with you." Rosa looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she looked at her brother, really looked at him the way she had always been able to look at him, straight past the armor and to the actual person inside, who had always been softer and more frightened than he let anyone see. "Okay," she said quietly. "Read it." He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, the handwriting on it large and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man writing something important and not wanting to get it wrong. Calvin unfolded it and held it in Robert's old mechanic gloves, the leather worn soft, conforming now slightly to his own hands, and he read. He read it silently first. His eyes moved down the page, and Rosa watched his face, and Lily, who had crept back to the doorway without anyone telling her not to watch from there. Calvin's face did a number of things in the time it took to read the letter. It went still. Then something moved behind his eyes. Then his jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Then his expression broke open entirely, briefly, completely, and then came back together into something new, something that had been reorganized, rearranged by whatever was on that page. He looked up. "He said," Calvin started, stopped, started again. His voice was wrong, too thick, too low. He said that the call I made in 2003, the one that I've been," he stopped again, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. "He said it saved 3 men, which I knew, but he said," he looked at the letter, he said, "the 3 of us talked about you every year on the day it happened. We called it Calvin Day. We never told you because we knew you'd tell us we were being stupid. You were never stupid about anything except yourself." Rosa made a small sound. Calvin kept reading. You have spent your whole life running from the people who love you because you're afraid of what they'll see when they get close enough. I was close enough. I saw everything. There was nothing to run from, brother. I am telling you this now because I am running out of time to tell you, and I will not leave without you knowing that you were the best man I served with and the best friend I had, and I release you from everything you think you owe me. Go be with your sister. Go be with your family. Stop moving long enough to let someone see you. That's all. That's everything. The room held the words. Lily was crying quietly in the doorway with the particular silence of a child who has learned to cry without asking for attention. Rosa had both hands over her face. Calvin folded the letter carefully exactly as it had been folded and put it back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the cushion beside him, and he sat there with Robert's gloves on his hands, and he breathed, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then Rosa lowered her hands. Her face was wet, but her voice when it came was steady. "Calvin Reyes," she said, "I have been trying to say that to you for 20 years. "I know," he said, "and it took a dead man and a 96-year-old woman to get through to you." "Apparently," she shook her head. "Unbelievable." But she was almost smiling. "Rosa." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the closest he'd been to her since he sat down. "Tell me what the doctor said." "All of it. Don't clean it up." Her expression shifted. The almost smile held, but underneath it, something steadier and more serious settled in. "Stage 3, she said. "Pancreatic. Started chemo 6 weeks ago." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Dr. Mercer is she's good, she's honest, she doesn't sugarcoat. She said the next 3 months will tell us a lot." She paused. "She said it would help to have family here." "I'm here," Calvin said. "You're here now," Rosa said. "Not an accusation. A check." "I'm not leaving," he said. She looked at him. "What about work?" "I'll figure it out." "Calvin, you can't just—" "Rosa." He held her gaze. "I am not leaving. I will sleep on your couch. I will drive Lily to school. I will sit here and watch that cooking show with you and pretend to like it, and I will be here when Dr. Mercer needs someone to be in the room, and I will be here in the morning and at night, and I am not leaving." He paused. "I should have been here 3 weeks ago. I'm not losing another 3 weeks." Rosa looked at her brother for a long moment. 20 years of distance lived between them, all those unreturned calls, all those promised visits, all those small abandonments that accumulate into something large. She looked at him and she held all of that, and then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because he was here now and he was staying, and she was having a good day, and she was not going to spend a good day on the way to bad ones. "The couch is uncomfortable," she said. "I've slept on worse." "There's a spare room," she said. "I just called it a couch to see if you'd complain." He stared at her. "You've been sick for 6 weeks and you're still running tests on me." "I have been running tests on you since 1971, she said. "I'm not stopping because of a diagnosis." And Calvin laughed, and this time it was full and real and sudden, and Rosa laughed too. And from the doorway, Lily laughed, surprised into it. And the sound of the 3 of them in that room was something that had not existed in that house before this afternoon, something new and improbable, and for all its improbability, absolutely necessary. It lasted about 15 seconds. Then Lily pushed off the doorframe and walked fully into the room and sat on the floor beside Calvin's chair and leaned against it the way kids lean against things they've decided to trust. And Calvin looked down at her and then at Rosa, and then at the room that was not his room, in the house that was not his house on the street he'd never been to before today. He reached down and pulled Robert's gloves off one then the other and set them on his knee. Lily looked at them. "Can I see those?" she said. He handed them to her. She turned them over in her hands, felt the worn leather, put one on her own hand, which disappeared inside it. She looked up at him. "Whose were they?" "A kid named Robert," Calvin said. "He died a long time ago, but his mom wanted someone to use them." Lily considered this with the gravity that 12-year-olds bring to things adults have already processed. "She sounds nice," she said. "She's the most remarkable person I've ever met," Calvin said. "And I met her this morning." Lily handed the gloves back. "What's her name?" "Margaret," he said. "Miss Maggie." Lily turned to Rosa. "Mom, can we do something like that?" "Like for a stranger." Rosa looked at her daughter, and something in her face went soft and fierce, At the same time, the specific expression of a parent watching their child be exactly who they hoped they'd be. "Yeah, baby," she said. "We can absolutely do something like that." None of them knew yet. Not Calvin with the letter in his pocket and the gloves on his knee. Not Rosa with her good day and her 3 months and her honest doctor. Not Lily with one oversized glove on her 12-year-old hand. That what had started this morning in booth 6 of the Bluebell Diner was already moving beyond the 4 of them. That Donna had told her husband the story that evening, and he had written it down because he said it was the kind of thing you wrote down. That Gary Purcell had texted his brother's other 2 surviving unit members, the ones who had lived because of Calvin's call, in 2003, the ones who celebrated Calvin Day every year, to tell them Calvin was on his way to his sister, and both of them had responded within minutes. And none of them knew that Margaret Holloway, sitting in booth 6 the following Tuesday at precisely 7:15 a.m., her coffee already waiting, was going to look up at the door when the broken bell chimed, and that what she saw when she looked up was going to change everything again. But that was still ahead. Right now, in a house on Beaumont Street in Savannah, Georgia, a man who had been running for 37 years had finally stopped. And the stopping felt nothing like dying. It felt like the first clean breath after a long time underwater, the surface breaking the air, arriving, the body remembering what it had been made to do. It felt against every expectation like coming home. The following Tuesday came the way Tuesdays always came in Clover Falls, quietly, without announcement, as if the week had simply exhaled and arrived at the same place it always arrived. Donna got to the Bluebell Diner at 6:15, an hour before Margaret was due, and she spent that hour doing what she always did, setting up brewing the first pot, listening to Earl complain about the delivery order being wrong again, but she moved differently than she usually moved on Tuesday mornings. She straightened booth 6 twice. She made sure the coffee was fresh at exactly 7:10. She had not told Earl about Calvin, about Gary, about Frank's garage, or Robert's gloves, because some things needed to be held carefully before they were handed around. But she had told her husband. His name was Pete, and he drove a delivery truck for a lumber company, and he was not, by his own admission, a man given to sentiment. He cried at exactly 2 things: the national anthem and their daughter's 3rd-grade Christmas pageant, and he had spent 6 years insisting the pageant one didn't count because he'd had something in his eye. But when Donna had come home Monday evening and told him everything, starting with the motorcycle in the lot and ending with Calvin pulling out of Frank's driveway with a dead boy's gloves on his hands, Pete had sat at the kitchen table and not said anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Write it down, Donna." "What, all of it?" "Write it down. That's not the kind of thing you let go of." Donna had looked at him. "I'm not a writer, Pete." "Nobody who has something real to say is a writer," he said. "Write it down." She had not written it down yet, but she was thinking about it. At 7:14, the broken bell chimed. Margaret came through the door at her customary pace, deliberate, unhurried each step, going exactly where it intended to go. She had her black purse. She had her 2 bobby pins. She was wearing a gray cardigan over a white blouse, and she looked, as she always looked, like someone who had made a decision about who she was a long time ago and had never revisited it. She settled into booth 6. Donna brought the coffee without being asked. "Well," Margaret said. "Well, what?" Donna said. "Don't play innocent, Donna. It doesn't suit you. Have you heard from him?" Donna set down the coffee pot and reached into her apron pocket and produced her phone and set it on the table in front of Margaret without a word. Margaret looked at the screen. On it was a text message from a number saved as Calvin Biker. It read, "Tell Miss Maggie I got here. Rosa's having a good day. Lily says thank you for the gloves, even though she doesn't know yet that she's thanking her. I slept in a real bed. First time in a while. I'll call when I can." Margaret read it twice. Then she picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and was quiet for a moment. "He got there," she said. "He got there," Donna confirmed. Margaret nodded, just once. The same small final nod she'd given Calvin across the diner table, the one that asked nothing and assumed nothing, and simply acknowledged what was true. "Good," she said. Donna slid into the opposite booth seat, the impulse again, the same one she'd had a week ago, still slightly unauthorized. But Margaret again did not tell her to leave. "There's something else," Donna said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Gary Purcell called me yesterday," Donna said. "He got my number from Frank. He wanted to know how to reach Calvin, and I gave him the number. And then he told me," she paused, pulling the words into order. "Apparently there are 2 other men. from Calvin's unit, from 2003. The ones who came home because of what Calvin did. Margaret was very still. Gary texted both of them, Donna said, to tell them Calvin was writing to his sister. And both of them, one lives in Charlotte, one in Mobile, both of them texted back within minutes. And what they both said was basically the same thing. They said, "Tell us if he needs anything." The diner hummed. Coffee percolated. Somewhere Earl dropped something metallic and swore under his breath. "Tell me their names," Margaret said. Donna blinked. I don't know if Gary..." "Find out their names," Margaret said, simply, as if this were already decided which in the particular economy of Margaret Holloway's mind it was. Donna stared at her. "Miss Maggie, what are you planning?" Margaret picked up the menu she never read and held it in front of her face. "Buckwheat pancakes," she said, "with blueberries if you have them." "We have them," Donna said slowly. "Good. And find me those names." Donna took the menu back and stood up and looked at this woman, this small, precise, 96-year-old woman who had walked into a diner 6 days ago with no plan more elaborate than coffee and had somehow set in motion something that was still moving, still expanding outward in every direction like a stone dropped in still water. And she thought, "I am going to write this down. Tonight, I'm writing all of it down." What happened next happened fast. At 7:52 a.m., Donna's phone buzzed on the counter where she'd left it. She looked at the screen and called across the diner without thinking, "Miss Maggie." "It's him." Margaret turned in her seat. Donna picked up and held the phone to her ear and said, "Calvin," and then held it out. "He wants to talk to you directly." Margaret looked at the phone for a moment. She had a phone of her own, but she treated it the way people of her generation often treated technology, as a slightly suspicious appliance that occasionally performed useful functions. Then she took it and held it to her ear, with the particular careful posture of someone who had not grown up with wireless devices. "Calvin," she said. His voice came through the phone different than it had sounded across a diner table. More open. Something in the acoustics of a phone conversation stripped the last layer of performance away. "Miss Maggie," he said, "I hope it's okay that Donna gave me her number and I'm..." "Stop fussing," she said. "How is Rosa?" A pause. "She had a hard night," he said. "Not the best morning, but she's talking. She talked to her doctor this morning and I was in the room and..." His voice steadied. "The doctor said having family present changes things. She said she's seen it, the outcomes shift when people aren't alone." Another pause. "I was thinking about that, about what you said, about the difference between choosing to be alone and not thinking you're worth the company." "And," Margaret said, "Rosa has never not thought she was worth the company," Calvin said. "She always knew. She just didn't have anyone left to ask." He stopped. "I was the person to ask. I was the one she should have been able to call and have me there the same day, not 3 weeks later." "Calvin," Margaret said, I know, don't carry the weight of it, drive fast, all of that." His voice had a rough edge that was the opposite of self-pity. It was self-reckoning, which is harder and more honest. "I'm not carrying it the same way anymore, but I want to be clear-eyed about it, about what it cost her to wait." "That," Margaret said quietly, "is the most adult thing you've said to me." A beat of silence on the line. "Lily wants to know if she can write you a letter," Calvin said. The diner went out of focus for Margaret just briefly. "A letter," she said. "She says she doesn't text. She says texting is for people who don't have enough to say." He paused. "She's 12 and she's already insufferable, and I am completely crazy about her." Margaret made a sound small, involuntary, surprised out of her. "Tell Lily I would like nothing more," she said. "Booth 6 Bluebell. Diner Clover Falls. Donna can make sure I get it." "I'll tell her," he said. "Then, Miss Maggie, I need to tell you something." The quality of his voice had shifted again. Slower, more careful. The way you slow down approaching something that matters. "I read the letter," he said. "Dennis's letter. I read it out loud. To Rosa, to Lily, all 3 of us on the couch yesterday evening." He stopped. "And when I finished reading it, Lily asked me why Dennis called it Calvin Day. And I had to explain what happened in 2003. What I did and what it going to..." He was quiet. "It was the first time I've said it out loud to anyone outside the unit. 37 years and I never said it out loud." Margaret held the phone very still. How did it feel? She said. A long pause. Like putting something down, he said. A very heavy thing that I've been carrying so long they'd stop noticing the weight. Another pause. And Rosa said, she said, Calvin, I knew about all of this. Dennis told me years ago, and I said, Rosa, when? And she said, the year after you came back. He called me and told me to look after you because you weren't going to look after yourself. The words landed in Margaret's chest. She's known for 37 years, Calvin said. She's been looking after me from a distance for 37 years, and I never knew. Brothers, Margaret said softly, you never know what's happening on your behalf. No, he said, you don't. He took an audible breath. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. I'm always honest with you, she said. Robert, he said, the name quiet and careful. When you lost him, did it get, I'm watching Rosa, and I'm thinking about what comes next, and I need to know, did it? He stopped, the question too large to finish. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. It gets different, she said. Much smaller, not lighter, but your capacity grows to meet it. The grief doesn't shrink, you get bigger. She paused, and you fill the space with things that matter. That's not a platitude. That's what actually happens if you let it. On the other end, Calvin Reyes was silent for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. Okay. Call me again, she said. Next Tuesday. I'll be here. I know you will, he said. Booth 6, 7, 15. Sharp, she said. She handed the phone back to Donna and picked up her coffee, and the diner carried on around her, and nobody in it knew exactly what had just passed between a 96-year-old woman and a 58-year-old man on a Tuesday morning in Georgia. But Donna knew enough of it to stand behind the counter and feel the specific sensation she'd been feeling all week of being present at something that would not have happened without an ordinary decision made in an ordinary moment by someone who simply looked out the window and chose to act. The pancakes arrived, buckwheat with blueberries fresh. Margaret ate them slowly and completely, which was unusual. She normally left half. Earl, passing through the dining room on some errand, saw the clean plate and said nothing but looked mildly unsettled. The way people look when something they relied on being consistent turns out to be variable. At 9:47 a.m., 2 hours and 32 minutes after Margaret had walked through the door, the broken bell chimed again. Donna looked up. The man who walked in was somewhere around 60, compact and careful, wearing clean clothes that had been packed and unpacked from a bag. He had the kind of face that had been through something and come out the other side with more lines than he'd started with and more steadiness too. He stood just inside the door and looked around the diner with the expression of someone who had an address and a name and had driven from somewhere far enough that arriving felt like a destination. His eyes landed on booth 6. Donna moved out from behind the counter. Can I help you? I'm looking for someone, he said. Her name is Margaret Holloway. Donna went still. Who are you? My name is James Teller, he said. I served with Calvin Reyes, 2001 to 2004. He paused. Gary Purcell reached out to me. He said Calvin came through this town. He said, he stopped and something moved across his face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite emotion, but lived in the space between the two. He said there was a woman here who bought Calvin breakfast and told him to go to his sister. And he shook his head slightly. He said it changed something, and I wanted to, He looked at the booth in the corner, at the small, white-haired woman sitting very straight with both hands around her coffee cup. I wanted to thank her. Is that her? Donna looked at Margaret. Margaret was already looking back. She raised one hand, the same small, steady gesture she had raised toward Calvin through the window exactly 1 week ago. James Teller crossed the diner and stood at the end of booth 6, and he looked at this woman, and Margaret looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, Ma'am, I'm alive because of Calvin Reyes, and apparently Calvin Reyes is where he needs to be because of you. Margaret studied him. Sit down, James, she said. He sat. Tell me about 2003, she said. He blinked. That's not... You drove here from where, she said. Charlotte. Charlotte to Clover Falls is over 300 miles, she said. A man doesn't drive 300 miles to say thank you and not say the rest of it. Tell me about 2003. James Teller looked at this 4'11", 96-year-old woman with her two bobby pins and her clear, absolute eyes. And he did the thing Calvin had done. And Gary had done before him. He stopped performing composure and simply sat there as the person he actually was. And he told her. He told her what happened on the day that Calvin had always carried like an open wound, the decision Calvin made, the men who lived because of it, the one who didn't, and why Calvin had never been able to accept the accounting, the way he'd subtracted the loss and refused to add the saved. He told her what it was like to come home and lose track of Calvin, how they'd tried to reach him through the years, and he'd always kept just enough distance. He told her about Calvin Day, how the three of them called each other every year on that date, how Dennis had answered the call 11 times and then not answered for the 12th time because he was already gone, how the two who remained had kept calling each other anyway. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering consolation, with the same quality of attention she had given to Calvin, the full unperforming kind that said, "I am here, this matters, keep going." When he finished, she said, "And you drove 300 miles this morning because Gary said someone had done something real," James said, "and I've spent 23 years thinking about what's real and what isn't, and I wanted to see it." He looked around the diner, the vinyl, the formica, the broken bell. "This isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something bigger." Margaret smiled, the real one, the one that reached everything. "The biggest things," she said, "always happen in the smallest rooms." Donna brought James coffee without being asked. He wrapped his hands around it the way cold people wrap their hands around warm things, and Margaret watched him and thought about Calvin on the curb, and about Robert on the motorcycle, and about Henry's letter that arrived 6 months late and had said the one true sentence, and she thought about the room she kept inside herself, the one she opened sometimes and stood in, and then closed again, and she thought some days you don't close the door. Some days you leave it open and you let people walk through it, and it does not diminish what's inside. It only adds to it. "Are you going to Savannah?" she said to James. He looked up. I came here first because..." "Go to Savannah," she said. "Calvin is there. Rosa needs people around her who knew Calvin when he was something other than alone. And Lily needs to understand that her uncle mattered to more people than she knows." She paused. "Can you call the other man, the one in Mobile?" James stared at her. "Marcus?" "Call Marcus," she said. "Tell him to go to Savannah." "Ma'am, you can't just..." "James." The single word, the period, the paragraph. "Can you call Marcus?" A long pause, then James Teller reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He made the call right there at booth 6, and Margaret listened to his side of it, terse and surprised, and then warming the way men who have shared the worst things warm to each other faster than anyone else. And when he hung up, he said, "Marcus can be there by tomorrow afternoon." "Good," Margaret said. "You're something else," James said, not with wonder exactly, with the tone of a man recognizing something he doesn't have a proper word for. "I'm a woman who has been alive long enough to know that people need each other more than they need almost anything else," she said. "And that pride is the most expensive thing most people will ever own." She looked at him. "Now drink your coffee," she said, "and then go." He drank it. He finished it in 4 minutes. He stood up and he looked at her and he said, "Calvin's lucky he stopped here." "He didn't stop on purpose," Margaret said. "He took an exit he wasn't planning to take." James smiled wide and real. "Maybe that's the whole point," he said. He walked out. The bell chimed. Donna stood behind the counter and watched the door close and then looked at Margaret, who had turned back to her coffee cup, which was empty and was holding it in both hands anyway. The way you hold something when putting it down feels too final. "Miss Maggie," said Donna said. "Pete wants to write this down," Donna said. "Everything, the whole story." Margaret looked at her. "He says it's the kind of thing that should be written down," Donna said. "He says stories like this, if you don't write them down, they go away, and things that go away can't help anyone anymore." Margaret considered this for a moment. "Tell Pete," she said slowly, "to write it down." Donna felt something unlock in her chest. "Yeah, write all of it," Margaret said. "The motorcycle in the lot, the food on the curb, the envelope, the gloves." She paused. "Write it the way it happened, without making it bigger than it was. It was a woman who looked out a window and saw a person who needed something, that's all. Don't make it bigger than that." "But it became bigger than that," Donna said softly. Margaret looked at her with those dark, clear, ancient eyes. It became what it became, she said, because it started small, because someone didn't look away. She set the empty coffee cup down. That's the thing worth writing. Not the size of what happened, the size of the first decision. Donna pressed her lips together hard. Now, Margaret said, reaching for her purse, I believe I owe you for the pancakes. You don't owe me anything, Miss Maggie. I pay my way, Margaret said, in the tone that ended arguments. She counted out the bills. She placed them on the table, precise and deliberate. She stood one hand on the table for just a moment, then upright and certain. She walked toward the door. Same time next week, Donna called after her. Margaret did not turn around. I'll be here, she said. The broken bell chimed, and Margaret Holloway, 96 years old, 4 feet 11 inches, 2 bobby pins, exactly in place, walked out into the October morning, the same way she had walked and the same way she walked into every morning, with the quiet, absolute conviction of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the smallest choices carry the greatest weight, that a window looked out of at the right moment can redirect a life, that a cup of coffee and a seat across from a stranger can be the hinge on which something enormous turns, and that the world does not need grand gestures or grand people. It needs ordinary people who refuse in the ordinary moment to look away. 3 weeks later, Rosa Reyes began her second round of chemotherapy. Calvin was in the room. James Teller was in the waiting area. Marcus Webb had driven up from Mobile and was parked outside in his truck, unable to sit still, sending Calvin updates every 15 minutes. Lily was at school doing the thing 12-year-olds do when the adults insist that normal things must continue going through the motions of normal with everything she had because her mother had told her that showing up was its own kind of courage. And in booth 6 of the Bluebell Diner in Clover Falls, Georgia, at precisely 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, a letter arrived from Margaret Holloway. Small envelope, slightly uneven handwriting, the handwriting of someone who cared more about what they were saying than how it looked on the page. Donna brought it over without reading it. Margaret opened it with the small silver letter opener she kept in her purse. Inside, in 12-year-old handwriting, it said, Dear Miss Maggie, my uncle told me what you did. He said you looked out the window and decided he was worth it. I want you to know that he's worth it. He's been sleeping in the spare room and he cooks terrible eggs, but he's here every morning when I come downstairs, and I didn't know that I needed that until it was there. Thank you for seeing him. Some people are hard to see. I think you're someone who looks harder than most. I'm going to try to be like that. Love, Lily Reyes. P.S. Mom says the gloves brought good luck. I think she's right. Margaret read the letter once. She folded it carefully, exactly in thirds. She put it in her purse, in the same inner pocket where Henry's letter lived, the one that had arrived 6 months late, the one with the one true sentence, and she closed the clasp with the small, definitive click it always made. She picked up her coffee. Outside, Clover Falls was doing what it always did on Tuesday mornings, and inside the Bluebell Diner was doing what it always did. And in booth 6, a 96-year-old woman who had looked out a window at exactly the right moment sat with her coffee in both hands and her purse on the seat beside her, carrying everything she had ever lost and everything she had ever found. And she was not diminished by any of it. She was made of it, built from it, held together by the specific, unbreakable knowledge that a life spent paying attention is a life that compounds interest in ways no ledger can measure. She looked out the window. The morning was bright and cold and completely ordinary. She looked at it until she was sure she had seen it, really seen it, and then she took a sip of her coffee and she was content.